Hello everybody and welcome to our virtual 67 Pall Mall. Finally for this evening, Richard Bamfield MW will be talking with Emily Falconer from Viña Carmen Estate in Chile. Now we're very pleased to be joined by Jasper Morris MW, author of Inside Burgundy, who is back telling us today about the Clos St-Jacques vineyard from all of its 5 producers from the 2017 vintage. So please chat away on the side, share with us what you're drinking and where you're drinking it from, and put your photos on social media with hashtag 67FromHome. As usual, we'll have 15 minutes at the end to ask questions and 2 polls tonight. So a big welcome, Jasper.
Thank you, Ronan. I can report that all is well in Burgundy. No horrible weather. It's been pretty warm, but not the real dog days, exceptional heat. The vineyard vintage rather keeps seeming to get closer and closer. So maybe as early as the 20th of August for some people, and the 25th will be probably the big kickoff.
Yeah.
That's the news so far. Now I hope I'm going to be able to keep you amused for a full hour, because today we only have 5 wines to talk about and we only have 1 vineyard to talk about. But it's such a great vineyard and the wines are going to be compelling, and I think I will easily manage to chat with you for the following hour. So welcome everybody, and as Ronan mentioned, do have a chat on the chat and tell us where you are from, and if you don't have the samples of the 5 Clos St-Jacques wines, then tell us what you're drinking. So a little bit about the vineyard first up, and let's have the Gevrey Chambertin map, the only one really we have to worry about tonight. Thank you, Ronan. And everything is all from this one vineyard, which I am going to just draw a line round. Here we go, boing, boing, boing. Le Clos St-Jacques. So there you have one vineyard, and you can see that the way the contours move round, that it is both, that tells you north, south, east, west. So we are east, southeast, pretty much southeast. Which is unusual exposure for Burgundy. It's more often east, but that means the southeast exposure means that you get the morning sun, you keep the warmth during the day, and it's balanced a little bit by the cool air that comes down the Combe de Lavaux here and spreads out below. But the Clos St-Jacques is protected a little bit by the stone walls that surround the Clos, whereas Lavaux St-Jacques next door gets everything. So we're not really going to need this map again, except we'll just keep it up for a moment, because here in Clos St-Jacques, give it its heart just to remind us where we are. You can see that it's separated by some way from the Grand Crus of Gevrey Chambertin, which are all the vineyards in that light purple color over towards the left. Chambertin, Chambertin, Clos de Bez, and the 7 satellites like Charme, La Trissière, Masouet, etc., Chambertin. Because it is one of the enduring questions over the centuries is whether or not Clos St-Jacques could have been, should have been made a Grand Cru. And that's something that we will discuss later on, and indeed is the subject of one of our 2 polls tonight, along with the old faithful regular of which is your favorite wine. So Clos St-Jacques, in fact, though it's now all one vineyard, back in the Napoleonic times, when they started detailing the cadastre, the cadastral side of the maps, giving everything names and boundaries, it was 2 parts. So the upper part of the vineyard, so just about on the contour line that you can see above the words Le Clos, that was just called St-Jacques, and below was Clos St-Jacques. And it rather looks as though St-Jacques on its own was slightly better thought of, which is a surprise, because judging from elsewhere in Burgundy, at least in the 19th century, it was the middle of the slope to lower slope that tend to get the best results, the most well thought of vineyards, more than the upper part of the slope. Where does it get its name from? St-Jacques. Could I have the first photograph, please, Ronan? We'll come back to that, just the first photograph. There we go. You see in the middle of there is a little bit of a, well, it could almost be a miniature chapel. And it used to have a statue of Saint-Jacques de Compostelle, because this was on the the Pilgrim's Road to Santiago de Compostela. Of course, Santiago is translated as Saint-Jacques in French, St. James in English. Well, we've got that picture. If you look upslope beyond the wall, you can see that white patch. That's in a vineyard called Estonel at Saint-Jacques, and it's about to be replanted. But that is a pure white milestone underneath with a very, very white topsoil, as is the bit next to it, which has recently been replanted. And it might well be a soil that could have been more suited to white grapes than to red, but the rules say it has to be red. Anyway, that's Domaine Orimenia is going to replant that. Okay, so let's go back to the either the map, or we'll go back to the main map, actually, if we may, Ronan. Let's talk about the history a little bit. And in the first part of the 20th century, people start taking a look at what's going to be appellation contrôlée here and there, and what will have an appellation of its own, which would make it a Grand Cru. Thus, Chambertin is a Grand Cru, and other vineyards that you see here on this map in the orange color are Premier Crus, Gevrey Chambertin Premier Cru. So there was two requests which went before a tribunal in February of 1931. And the main request, which the largest owners, which were the Serre family, S-E-R-R-E, Serre family of Meursault, and a member by marriage, the Comte de Moucheron, who was sort of acting on their behalf, they were saying, we want this to be called Chambertin Saint-Jacques, or Saint-Jacques Chambertin. And that's the argument they put forward. And they were prevented from having that for three reasons. First reason is that the local syndicate had already put forward their ideas, which in fact are the vineyards that you can see there in purple, Chambertin, Clos de Bez, and the satellites. And it didn't include either Combotte on the left, the southern end, nor indeed Clos Saint-Jacques, which were the two main vineyards which were demanding to be added. The second reason is that Clos Saint-Jacques is 800 plus meters away from Chambertin and Clos de Bez as the crow flies, and is also divided by the cool valley of the Comte de Lavaux. And the third reason was that the main owner, the Serre family and the Comte de Moucheron, they were foreigners from Meursault, and therefore they didn't want to give them the leg up, if you see what I mean. And historically, traditionally, there'd been quite a lot of rivalry between this end of the Côte de Nuits and the main part of the Côte de Nuits, and in particular, the canton of Beaune, in which Meursault would be included. So that didn't work. On the same day, before the tribunal, somebody else had asked for an appellation Saint-Jacques, which was to include Clos Saint-Jacques and also maybe Lavaux and Castier, several of the vineyards there, but to make it into its own separate appellation, which would in effect have been a Grand Cru covering Clos Saint-Jacques and the neighbours. But the Comte de Moucheron and his family didn't support that because they were fighting the other cause to make it Chambertin Saint-Jacques. And so that fell on deaf ears and didn't happen. But if they'd really pushed for it then, they might possibly have got it. So in a later, slightly later after this, in the 40s and into the early 50s, the whole Clos Saint-Jacques vineyard becomes a monopoly of the Comte de Moucheron and his family. And so that's all well and good. But unfortunately, the Comte de Moucheron was a bit of a playboy, probably had a bit of a gambling habit, certainly wasn't looking after his land as well as he should have been. They also had the Chateau de Meursault in Meursault, and their vineyards, and they had plenty of other agricultural wealth all around France. But times got tough, and in 1955, he sold up. And if we can move to the next map now. Thank you. And it ended up being sold in 5 parts. Originally it was going to be 4. So 1 and 2, Armand Rousseau signed up for, but then, so the story goes, and we've heard this about other vineyards of his, I don't know if it's strictly true or not, he was told by his wife that he couldn't have that much. So he was chatting to his friend and hunting mate, Fernand Pernot, and said, look, you know, give me a bit of a break so I can get some peace and quiet at home. Why don't you take part of it? So slice 2 on that map went to Monsieur Pernot, and that has then gone down through descent into the Fourier family. So that's Fourier. 3 and 4 were bought by Bernard Claire of Domaine Claire Dow, and kept as initially as one piece, but subsequently, when there was some disruption in that family, one member of the family sold her slice, that's slice 4, slice 3 rather, got sold to Louis Jadot. So 3 is Jadot, 4 remains now with Bruno Claire, and 5 is Sylvie Emonin. And the story there is quite interesting because her grandfather, Henri Emonin, born in 1905, used to work firstly just as a labourer and subsequently as a sharecropper for the Comte de Moucheron. And so when the vineyard was up for sale, he was desperate to get some. So I will tell you more about that when we come to the wines, but if we can have the, we've had the first photograph, so we'll have the second photograph. There's the first, and there's the second. Now, if you follow that Sylvie in the foreground, this is a recent picture because I went and walked around the vineyard this very morning in order to get the latest news to share with everybody this evening. But if you look to the background of that picture, beyond the tree, you will see that same, thank you, Ronan, your mouse is scurrying around it. You will see that same little mini chapel in which the statue of Clos St-Jacques used to be lodged. And I remember Sylvie telling me once that when she was a small child, sort of came bounding back from school, and they would have what in French would be called the goûter, the sort of afternoon tea of a bit of bread with a lump of chocolate in it. And that would be put inside that little mini chapel. There was no longer the statue there, even as long ago as that. It would be put inside the chapel, and she would scamper through the vines and go and collect it and sit up there, sit on the wall and eat it. Sylvie is a granddaughter of Henri Emonin. Henri was succeeded by his son, Michel, her father, who was born in 1938. And then Sylvie started working with her dad in the 1990s, but made it quite clear quite early on that basically if she was going to stay and do the work there, she wanted to run it her way. And already she persuaded her dad to start domain bottling, which I think happened in 1989. They didn't really bottle anything beforehand. From 98, it's purely Sylvie. Father retires from that time, though he didn't really retire, he was still around, but he was working for her, and she was in complete control. And in 2000, the domain changed from Michel Emonin and daughter to Sylvie. So there she is at the at the foot of her vineyard. And if we can just look at the next slide. Waiting for. We've maybe the one either we skipped one or it should be the next one after that. That's the one I wanted. So that is from just in front of where Sylvie is standing, looking up at the vineyard. And now I've always been taught that Gevrey, Clos St-Jacques has really got 3 soil types. And looking at this, you can see 2. You can see the brownish clay limestone with plenty of chips of limestone in it, because this is the bottom of her bit of vineyard. And then you go up to the top and you can see even from the distance that it's much, much lighter. So that is a white milestone at the top and a standard clay limestone down below. And I said to Sylvie, well, why can I only see 2? And she said, well, look at the map. If we go back to the division of the various plots, sorry to keep you leaping around, you will see there, I'll just take control for half a second. I've probably still got it. Press. If we follow the line along the bottom, beg your pardon, sorry, along here, so that's the bottom. Where it rises up here, it's because there are buildings. There's Bruno Claire's old mum's house, she's no longer with us, and then there is Michel Emonin's house and the Sylvie Emonin winery here. But it's particularly for the Fourier and the Rousseau plots, it's quite a bit lower down. So broadly speaking, the bottom section is there. The middle section is, I won't call this exactly right, but we'll say it's there. And then there's the top section up there. So that gives you the idea. And if you flick back, we'll stop on that bunch of grapes this time, Ronan. There we go. That was taken this morning in the Rousseau bit, and I just wanted to show where we are this year. Two things to note about that. One is that the veraison or color change is absolutely in full swing, or it is in that vineyard. So it's not yet quite reached the midpoint, but it's getting there, because those were grapes, bunches that were turning, and a couple of others haven't really started yet. You can also see this year, they were quite spaced out bunches, and some of the grapes have expanded in the space to be relatively large, a bit bigger than usual, but there's also lots of small ones. So we've got what the Antipodeans would call hen and chicken going on there, or mirandage in French. You can also see actually how healthy the leaves are, and every pic we're going to look at of the vines shows the same thing. There is just no sign of any damage of any sort this year. Touch wood that it may continue. Great. Move on a slide. So that first vine in front of us seems to have got a little bit of damage to it, but apart from that, the vines are looking healthy. Nicely ploughed there. There is also some colour change in Sylvie's vineyards, but oddly enough, none in Bruno Claire's, none in Jadot's, and I didn't actually look that closely, but I don't think I saw any in Fourier's either, which is slightly unusual. Thank you, Klaus. So I'm looking healthy too. Come from a jog? No, that is my natural summer colour. Even before I've had a glass of wine, I hasten to add. Good. So we'll start talking about the wines now. So those of you who've got them, please feel free to start in on Sylvie's wine. And what's quite interesting is, I mean, hers is noticeably dissimilar from any of the others. The rest have got more in common with each other than her wine does. So the domain is not biodynamic at all, and it's not branded as organic, but in fact there have been no pesticides, herbicides, etc. since 1990. A little bit of the colour you can see on the first vines are because this morning they got dusted down with a little bit of sulphur, but it was just sulphur. The vines are so healthy this year that she didn't even have to do the classic copper sulfate mix. It's no copper at all necessary this year, just sulphur, which is great and very rare, but this year thus far is exceptional in that respect. Here we are with her 2017, and the reason I chose 2017 is because A, we can get all the wines easily enough, and B, it's a delicious and accessible year. It wasn't quite as early and quite as hot, nearly as early, but not as hot as 18 and 19. There was a biggish crop in the reds, which meant that the wines are not ultra concentrated, but they're really attractive wines in 17, and I'm coming to appreciate them more and more. But I hope, and I haven't yet I didn't pre-taste them, I'm hoping that they're going to show attractively enough. Key difference between her and anybody else is that she has become a great stalwart for whole bunch fermentation. Her father didn't, she's introduced it, and her partner in private life is Dominique Laurent, a name that may well be known to many of you, who's a great fan of lots of new wood, and especially his new wood, because he became, first of all, a vigneron because he didn't like other people's wines, and then he became a barrel maker because he didn't like other people's barrels to put his wine into. So as you can gather, he is a relatively opinionated person, but he's pretty skillful at what he does. And she takes his top-of-the-range barrels for the Clos St-Jacques. Some years it can be 80 or 100% new wood. This year it was 60% new wood. Some years it can be 80+% whole bunch. This year it was 60%, because she would have gone for the higher percentages in years like 2015, 2018, when she felt there was more natural power in the wine. But it does make the wine show the winemaking, if you like, much more up front than some of the other examples we will see, and it takes a little while for that to calm down. I'm guessing that this is going to be the deepest, most purple coloured of all the wines. And certainly the note which I made when I was tasting it from barrel, this had a rich, deep purple with lighter rim. Extra density compared to our other wines, that's not surprising for Clos St-Jacques. Requires spending time with the bouquet, which feels a little bit stricter. Then it opens out nicely to a sweet, dark red fruit, good energy, a few minerals behind, some finesse despite the pronounced impact of the style, a long, fine and complex finish. And actually it was one of the samples which I like very much from Clos St-Jacques. And I scored it because I have to do that, 93 to 95 points. It being a barrel sample, it didn't get a definitive number. The oak is present to me today, but not too much so. It's a little bit more on the nose, a little bit less on the palate, but it is showing, it's supporting the richness of the fruit. It's almost a sort of a bramble fruit, a bit like a classic English summer pudding, but the acidity is less high than I expect from those fruits, because summer pudding fruit is made up of black currant, red currant, raspberry, and so on, which tend to be slightly higher in acidity than your actual grapes. Just park that to one side. I'm sure those of you who've got the wines are making notes copiously, and you will of course be asked to vote at the end for your preference. Lots of concentration of fruit here. At the moment, mostly at the front of the palate. Does continue through behind that, but I think the oak and a little bit the whole bunch structure is defining the finish more than elegance of fruit at this stage in its life. But of course, very young still. See that we have a question. I'm just going to keep half-tag. Sam wanted to know what's caused the mirandage this year. It was actually cooler and slightly windier weather during the flowering, which caused some of the grapes, the flowers, not to develop quite so well. So it did also string out the flowering just a little bit. So I'll just keep a little look what's going on. Victor wants to know, how does the whole bunch fermentation affect the wine? What does it change? It's quite complex. It has an effect physically. I actually did a whole Zoom on this, so I won't go into too much detail now, and you can catch up with it on my website or on the 67 Pall Mall website if you want to see all the detail on that. This time we'll refer back to it later on. It does change the aromatic profile a little bit as well, and so you tend to get more in the red fruit, and sometimes you get a little bit of a smoky effect. No longer nowadays that stems are riper do you get the herbaceous character that you used to get in earlier times. Okay, right. Well, let's have a little chat about Mr. Bruno Clare and his vineyard. What I didn't say was that Sylvie has got the second biggest holding, 1.60 hectares, and you would have seen on the initial map, we can check back with it later on, won't keep running backwards and forwards, on the initial map that her slice looks a little bit fatter than most of the others, but it doesn't go down quite as far. So next door you have we're at the northern edge and heading through to the south. Next door you have Bruno Clare. Not quite sure what we have next on the map front. All right, I'm pleased to see that the kit has just got to Sweden 2 hours ago. Huh. At least it got there in time. I hope it's in good condition, Jerome. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so in fact, we are looking here from the edge of Fourier across the Jadot, and Bruno Clare is just to the right of the path that you can see coming down through the middle. You'll also see a crossways path, which is sort of the divider between the white soil at the top and the brown soil further below. And if you look sort of center and to the right, you will see a slight difference in color. And it almost looks as though there's a greater density of planting. It's that there's a little bit more foliage in the Bruno Clair vines than there is in the Sylvie Emonard. And actually, I talked to Sylvie about the hedging, and she had recently hedged hers, and Bruno had hedged hers a little bit earlier. So he's got slightly more, a few more leaves appearing at the top. But also about pruning dates, because there is a theory that in this hot weather, you can actually slow down the ripening cycle a little bit if you prune as late as possible. And even in the old days, they had this expression, rien ne vaut la taille de mars, which means nothing is worth as much as pruning in March rather than before. And Sylvie pruned at the beginning of March, so relatively late, and Bruno pruned the latest of all of them at the very end of March. And possibly that's a factor in the fact that his ripening is slower, and that I didn't see a single grape on his section that had changed color, but nor did I on the Louis Jadot section, and they apparently were the earliest to do their pruning. I didn't get an exact date, but more like January. So, you know, this is all sort of technical MW stuff, but quite interesting as we're going into this vineyard in depth. So here is, as I say, it's more in the background, and to the right, but not extreme right, is the Bruno Clair sector. And he has just 1 hectare, one of the original 2, because his probably aunt, if I've got the family relationships right, sold hers to Louis Jadot. So we go back to Joseph Clair, who married a girl called Marguerite Daou, and she came from Marseille because Joseph Clair was invalided out the First World War and was in hospital in Dijon, and she nursed him, and the usual thing happened. Romance around the hospital bed, and they got married. And of course, it was Joseph Clair who invented the whole concept of Marseille Rosé, and he created this domain Clair Daou. So until some point in the 80s, you will see Clos St-Jacques from Clair Daou. Then there's a period with the split up of the domain when it comes under Bruno Clair's mother's maiden name. So it's domain G. Bartet, B-A-R-T-E-T. And then from 99, it becomes domain Bruno Clair. What else can I say about this? They also have some Casetier, which is just over the northern wall. And for a long period, what was really interesting is that the bulk of the 2 vineyards, the Casetier and Clos St-Jacques, were planted at the same time, in 1957, by the same team, pretty much on the same day or same week, using the same plant material. And so you could really see the difference between 2 vineyards could only really be down to the difference in where they are. It's not quite fair to say, because Casetier has plots all over the place and it doesn't have this line from top of the hill down to the bottom. So the Clos St-Jacques was the complete expression, and the Casetier, in fact, was only up at the top of the vineyard on the white soil. So not quite like for like. So Bruno Clair is a destemmer, as the rest will be, at least more or less. So Bruno took over during the 80s. He's sort of approaching retirement. He has 2 sons, Edouard and Arthur, who are getting involved. Had a wonderful tasting there. I think it was the 2017s with Edouard alongside. And every time I asked a question about some practice at the domain, they would both answer at the same moment, and one would say yes and one would say no, or vice versa. So it was really interesting to see what will happen. And I think Edouard and Arthur will be really interesting to see what they do in the years to come. But Bruno is one of the most fascinating, interesting people to taste with, alongside his friend and winemaker, Philippe Brun, who's been there almost since the start, really, with Bruno. So that will really be end of an era when that changes. So they might occasionally keep some stems, and perhaps more so coming up. He's like most people, they do less of the punching down and more of the pumping over these days. There's quite a bit of new oak. I don't have an exact percentage, but I'm going to say there's probably going to be 50–60% of new oak for the Clos St-Jacques. Come to think of it, I better pour myself some. while we talk. This is often one of my favorites. I don't think the domain is quite as consistent as some domains. Not, I think, their fault, but I think more that they have their style of making it, and some years really lend itself to it, and some a little bit less. When I tasted 2017 at the barrel stage, I also gave it a bracket. I remember I gave Sylvie's wine 93 to 95, and Bruno's I gave 92 to 96. So it will the median point is the same, but his wine was a little bit harder to judge at that stage. I said it was a ravishing mid-purple color. The fruit was a bit less detailed than his Castiller was, but with really good intensity for the vintage. Less immediately easy to read. There's a weight of sweet fruit with some dry tannins behind. It's more muscular style of wine and will need longer in barrels. So I just felt at that stage of its élevage, it was a little bit difficult for me absolutely to commit. So the wine seems to me to be less purple in it, but still a very good, I mean, none of these wines is going to be feeble in color, absolutely not. But slightly less intensity than Sylvie's wine, which is her winemaking that's delivered that, I would think. Perhaps the style of the barrels. New barrels, and I think her wine showed the new barrel a little bit more, do tend to change the intensity of the color in the wine. Yeah. Mark asks, incidentally, if the G. Bate wines are worth keeping an eye out for to think of the prices. You really don't see much of them around because Clos St-Jacques gets bought by people who want to drink it and do drink it. So I've rarely seen them in the secondary market, but they'd be very good. Yeah, because it would have been Bruno Claire making them. It was just a question of the labeling. And René from Denmark, what about the wind factor? Well, because he thinks it doesn't get talked about enough in Burgundy, and it is important it's cooler more than wind that drifts down from the combe, and so that's at the lower level, and then the wall that we saw with the little chapel in would protect that cool air flowing into Clos St-Jacques, whereas it is definitely a factor in the Lago St-Jacques. However, there is still a bit of air current, wind higher up, and that would also move around just underneath the forest, so at the upper part. I don't think it's a site that is dramatically affected by it, but it does also help that air circulation you get here. It does help from the disease point of view. And even in a disease year, I think vineyards like Clos St-Jacques are affected rather less than others. I'm finding this to be a very elegant wine. If you remember in my barrel tasting, I did talk about the dry tannins. There are one or two tannins in the background, but there's such a really charming, elegant sweetness of fruit before them that there is no feeling of an overly dry finish. But it's just there in the background as a structural factor. Quite high-toned, the bouquet. Short and volatile. You will see more volatility in Burgundy in 18 and quite possibly 19. Victor's offering some chocolate on the palate, not in the bouquet, but I do see what you mean on the palate. So it's really perfectly on the cusp between red and black fruit. We're getting some of each. So it's a balanced wine from a ripe year with a nice structure, correctly intense rather than over intense would be my particular take on it. Certainly I'm enjoying it and I'm hoping to go on enjoying it. I may or may not give myself a treat this evening. I had a little look in the cellar and the Clos St-Jacques, which popped out, was actually a Sylvie Emenin 2002, which was a year in which I only learnt this last year, and I bought myself a case of this, and I've had a few bottles. They've all been in perfect condition. But she said, you know what? I didn't use any sulfur at all in vinification in 2002. And it's not that she was trying to be a sort of a naturalista ahead of the others, but she just felt that the year was healthy enough and dry enough, and she just thought, if I don't need to, I won't. And she didn't need to and didn't, which is great. Okay, so Victor also asked, how is Gevrey different from Gevrey Chambertin? It's just, it isn't different. It's just I'm too lazy to say Gevrey Chambertin in full every year. And as many of you will know, up until 1845, I think it was Gevrey sous montagne, Gevrey en montagne, sorry, Gevrey in the mountains. And in 1845, approximately, they changed their name by deed poll to Gevrey Chambertin, hyphenated their Chambertin vineyard. So if I just say Gevrey, I'm being lazy. Grand. Okay, so that's two of our wines looked at. Why don't we? Only got 5 tonight, isn't that sad? Arguably, we could have had more. It is possible to find more than 5 Clos St-Jacques on the market. Anybody who's feeling like being a clever clogs can scribble on the side on the chat any other Clos St-Jacques they've seen in the last 15 years, which aren't the 5 we've got tonight. And I will reveal all a little bit later. But there's a challenge for the boffins amongst you. Nobody else owns vines here, but one person makes a second cuvee, has done since 2010, not every year. And there are 2 people. René says Lucien Lemoine, that could be one. I haven't seen, but that's possible actually. That would be an extra one. There are 2 other people who get a couple of barrels from, I believe, Sylvie. One being her husband stroke partner, Dominique Laurent, absolutely, well done, Stephen. And the other one, though I don't know if this continues, but in classical Burgundy fashion, if it used to happen, it sort of goes on through inertia, if nothing else. But Domaine Bourret, B-O-U-R-R-E in Gevrey Chambertin, certainly used to get it and possibly still do. But I think I don't think these wines ever appear on a wine list. I think they probably go to the same customers every year. On a, I can let you have it, but don't tell the world. And the other wine, which I haven't seen coming up on the chat yet, we'll come to later on when we find the producer. Won't be long, but it's not this one. Next up is Louis Jadot. So here we can see these are the vines to the left of the path as opposed to the right. Again, I looked at those and I didn't see any sign of grapes that were changing color. Yes, Patrick's mentioned Laurent. Dominique Laurent has made it probably every year for quite a while now. So, Jadot, it's a different style of vinification, of course, with Louis Jadot. It's always hard, it used to be hard to get Jacques Lardière to say exactly what he does, or did rather, because he'd go off in all sorts of metaphysical ideas, and he'd start saying a sentence, and then you would finish the sentence in the way that you thought he was meaning to get his corroboration. And he'd say, yes, yes, absolutely. But I got a feeling that however you finish the sentence, he'd say, yes, yes, absolutely. It was just his way of maybe not giving away trade secrets, plus the fact that he is one of those who sort of thinks that the wine should make itself and it shouldn't be about making wine and so on and so forth. But compared to most other producers in very recent times, they have stuck with doing the punching down, so a slightly more extractive style, and also Jacques and I believe his successor, who's a really good guy, Frédéric. So Fred has continued the same idea, I believe, which is not to calm the temperatures down. If it's a year in which the vinification starts zooming away at and giving off lots of high temperature, they've tended to be happy to allow the wines to ferment at highish temperatures. I'm sure nowadays they've got the equipment in place to cool it down. They're probably taking a little bit more care in these really hot years, but that has been traditionally the Jadot way of doing it. So it's a little bit in a, you can say classical, but classical styles change, and we can think of different things as classical. But it is a small amount more extractive, but without having ever been a brutal type of modernist extraction. Let's say it's an old-fashioned extraction, if you like. Destalked, destemmed. Three to 4 weeks during the fermentation, and then barrel aged for 18 months, but less new oak here, typically about a third. It's not the sort of domain that varies too much across the piece. They tend to keep the same general principles throughout. And the fruit appears in a sort of a different place almost on the palate. There's plenty right through the middle of the palate here. I'm finding a little bit less silky, if you like, in fruit style than Bruno Clair, but there is a very good density. The fruit completely covers the tannic structure, so for all the punching down. Between red and black fruit, it's a little bit, where 2/3, 3/4 red, and just a little bit of a few black fruits kicking around on the edges. A very graceful finish. I didn't give it quite such a good note in the barrel. I give it 91 to 94. At that point, there was more new oak showing on the nose, but also I was even then getting the depth of fruit. Some dark fruit notes, but quite good acidity, and there's still good acidity in this wine. Pick that up at the back of the palate. And some fractionally less ripe fruit compared to some other people's Clos St-Jacques, almost making me think a bit of rhubarb, but no, I think that's softened into clean red fruits nowadays. So plenty going on, but it's just a little bit, it wasn't quite in place at that time. I think it's coming through better now. And can take the place that it should take in the lineup. Yeah. Fang Tao just mentioned G Bate is a 93. That's the Bruno Clair wine, well, in the period when it was labeled as G Bate after his mother, rather than being a Gauchon. Okay, one other thing I looked out for was how big a difference there was in how all the vines were being looked after. And apart from the fact that there's a little bit less canopy on Sylvie's, her vines and Bruno Clair's vines were, if anything, trained a touch higher. Jadot's were trained a fraction lower, and then Rousseau and Fourier in between the two, much of a muchness. But maybe just before the harvest, we'll start to see a little bit more difference in the color of the leaves. I would say that the Emonin leaves were a tiny bit darker in green, and the Bruno Clair ones a little bit sort of lighter and fresher in color. That can be to do with the fact that Sylvie had just put on a sulfur treatment. It could be all sorts of reasons, who knows. But no reason to attribute any particular subsequent quality difference from any of those things. Hugo's asked if the alcohol is a touch less well integrated in 3. I think that is a characteristic of Jadot wines while they're young. I find that relatively consistently. I think it's to do with extra extraction that makes the wines feel a little bit chunkier. And in these years where the alcohol is higher than it used to be, it shows a bit more. I think that probably is going to settle down. I don't find it to be discordant, but I would agree with you that it's, at the moment, shows a fraction more. Right, Ronan, if you feel like finding us a new slide to look at. Okay, so we are looking here from the very bottom corner the south east end of the vineyard, or bottom left on the map, and we're looking across Rousseau's holding over towards the Fourier holding, and there's a patch in the middle you see that's been pulled out for replanting. That's still in Rousseau, and it's just a little bit beyond that that you go into Fourier. So, fascinating stuff here. The domain was pretty good in the time of his either grandfather or great uncle. I'm not quite clear which. I need to chase that up. Mr. Pernod, the hunting buddy of old man Rousseau. But at some point, somebody must have released some stock of vintages from the 70s under the Pernod Fourier label. And I've tasted it 2 or 3 times, the 78 in Shanghai of all places, from different hosts. And it's been consistent, it's been clearly authentic, and it's been very nice indeed. And once the 76 also, and as so often at the moment, the 76, which has been dour and difficult and tannic for so long, is now just putting its head above the parapet and showing lots of quality. So then the domain went through a period under Jean-Claude Fourier, father of Jean-Marie, in which I haven't seen the wines very much. Clive Coates in his books says he felt that the wine definitely went through, the domain went through a sort of less high quality patch. I can't really comment, I haven't seen enough of the wines. But certainly nobody was suggesting that they were of the quality which they are today when Jean-Marie, who is an extremely exuberant and very, very capable character, and one of those people who is unbelievably skilled at talking about his subject and sort of filling out the background and explaining his ideas. English wife Vicky, and really they are amongst the superstars of today. And those of you who buy or try and buy these wines will of course be aware that the pricing is, certainly the secondary pricing is getting out there. So this is a domain that since 2010 has done a second cuvee, very, very small volume, called the Cuvée Centenaire, probably just a couple of barrels. Their holding dates back to 1910, so in 2010 it was 100 years old, hence the Cuvée Centenaire. I'm trying to build up a database of all the really ancient vines in Burgundy, and this is one of them. So for some reason I actually gave this wine a complete score. I gave it 96 and 4 stars, one of my favorite wines of the vintage. They have a fractionally small holding. The last 2 people had exactly 1 hectare each, and Fourier has just got 0.89 of a hectare. And what I said, why don't I pull myself some while I am reading out the tasting note? My barrel tasting note was beautiful, concentrated mid-red purple. Concentrated complex nose, and if it seems less pure than some of his other Premier Crus, and I only say that because his style is of immense purity, that may be because there's so many different strands to it. The core of the wine, huge depth of dark fruits and refreshing red notes interweaved. No more than medium acidity, and the tannins are entirely integrated. That's my barrel tasting note. So everything is destemmed, but just recently he's begun to reintroduce some stems afterwards, selects the stems that he wants, and he thinks that doing that avoids any sort of aldehyde, volatile content that he feels some people get when they follow the whole bunch roll. So he thinks he gets rid of that. He hasn't gone down the super trendy, cutting edge system of raising the trellising, the way that La Lubis Loire and Charles Lachaud and in Gevrey du Gapi and probably some others are doing. He thinks that if you do that, then you allow the hormones to run riot in your vines. And he likes the idea of hedging because he thinks that stops the hormones, and so that the energy is going into the grape rather than into the hormones. And so what he does instead is he has a slightly wider foliage. So he hasn't gone higher, he's gone a little bit wider to make sure he's got a density of foliage, doesn't do the de-leafing, dead against de-leafing, because he doesn't want the sun on the grapes, and I completely agree with that. But he also thinks that de-leafing evaporates the water and makes for a sort of slightly artificial concentration. So, you know, he's thought out every single thing that he does in real detail. As Frank mentioned, Pierre Bourret I mentioned as one of the two, along with Laurent. So here we have, and I haven't tasted it yet, but oh, and the other thing, so I said no stems, even though he's just beginning to add a few back in, but that's very recent. And pretty much the whole cellar just gets 20% new oak. He wants to renew his oak regularly, but he doesn't want the new oak to speak too much, and he feels that all the wines should be able to cope the same amount. Yes. That's a pretty classy bouquet straight away. It's not the most obviously ripe, but it is one of the freshest. There's good acidity here. It's retained its acidity well. Just checking, I said no more than medium acidity, but it's showing in a very good way. It's quite a savory wine. It is much, much more now in a red fruit character compared to Sylvie's was more in the black fruit right at the start. And it's the texture of this wine across the palate is really fine and elegant, really fine boned and very persistent. So that's the style that Jean-Marie Fourier is putting together. I had bad luck right at the start when a couple of people in England who got on board very early on said, oh, I've got this amazing new producer. You know, and they served me the Clos St-Jacques of, might have been 99, it could have been other vintages, but I remember one case of 99. And every time the wine was just dumb and not showing. And I'd say, well, you know, I trust you, and you said how wonderful these wines are. And they say, well, I agree with you, it's just not showing well tonight. And I just had a couple of examples like that, 2 or 3 maybe. And so I was wondering what it was all about. But since then, I've joined a crowd of Fourier fans and had consistently good results. Very happy with that bouquet. Right, and just see, we might have another question that's come up. And Rafi has asked me if I rate the Combo 1 as well, and I certainly do, and that also is beautifully old vine. So after Clos St-Jacques, you move on to Castier, after Castier to move to Combo 1. That whole sector is, I think, really, really exciting place to be getting wines from. So yeah, no question about it. Okay. That on your screen, you saw a picture of a man knocking back his Bruno Clair and enjoying it. So we can put some Rousseau. Rousseau goes into the glass. Right, so Rousseau is sort of the magical one that most people are the most familiar with, well, when they can afford it. And it's only very, very recently that Rousseau started to put up his own prices from the domain, understandably, because when you can see the secondary market prices, there is a huge debate. I'm just wondering whether I might not do a Zoom at some point about wine pricing and how wines get to be the price they are today. I think that could be quite interesting. So somebody actually tried to get Rousseau to do separate cuvées from the different parts of the vineyard. So here where it looks as though this bit at the foreground is higher, but that's purely the optical illusion of having an incompetent photographer. But in fact, it does go up a very gentle slope, and it is very gentle to begin with, through to the middle ground, and then up the hill like all the others. And so they did experiment one year with the help of a stagiaire intern with starting to vinify them separately, tasted them, and they were no question in their mind, but the blend worked best. And they haven't joined others who'd like to make a super cuvée. And I can see the temptation as long as you are not denaturing the overall wine. But the best of the three singly wasn't as interesting as the three together. Right. Yes, Rousseau. So Rousseau, right from the start, said, okay, this is one of our top three vineyards. We've got Chambertin, Clos de Bers. We've got loads of other Grand Crus, Maisy Chambertin, Charme Chambertin, Clos La Roche, etc., Ruchot Chambertin, my favorites. But Clos St-Jacques is the other one of the on the podium, up there in the medal positions. And what they do is they give their three top wines anything up to 100% new wood, and the rest get either none or only a very small amount. It can vary from one vintage to another. And actually Suriel, who is, so the family goes Armand Rousseau, died in 1957. Charles Rousseau, born in 1923, took over in 57. He died just very recently. Let me just think when it would have been. He died, I think, in 2016. And he, though somewhat begrudging the fact that he had to handed over to his son, Eric, who is born in 57. Eric has been in sort of trying to take charge from any time from the 80s onwards, but for the last 20 plus years has been in charge. And now one of his two daughters, Suriel, is working with him. And Suriel also said that the reason for their new oak policy is basically, at least all the crews, possibly not the village, maybe the village too, they like to have things only in new oak or 1 year oak. So they work out what covers half the production goes into new oak, and that's going to be the Chambertin Clos de Bers, and almost all, but not necessarily 100%, of the Clos St-Jacques, occasionally a little bit of Clos La Roche or Ruchot. In this year, I think in 2017, I checked it out, I think they used 80% new oak. So I haven't tasted it yet, but this was my favorite from the barrel. Who knows? They're not blind tonight either. And very shortly in September, I'll be doing our Red Bergfest tasting on 2017's. We will have, I hope nothing goes wrong, all 5 of the Gevrey Chambertin Clos St-Jacques tasted blind. So unless we can tell them apart through the style, we won't know which is which. The sample I was given in barrel was actually from a new wood barrel. They don't sort of blend together from several barrels. And as I said, it was a magical wine from the very start. So much grace, no specific fruit content, a little more concentration at front rather than back of the palate, or so it seems. But then the aftertaste stretches out almost indefinitely. The nose blossoms, losing new oak character rapidly. So that was my note. So here, they just don't change anything. They can't see any reason to change. The only thing, Eric was dancing a jig when I tasted the 2018s. And again, when I saw him briefly, I tasted the 2019s with Suriel. But Eric said, 2nd year in a row. I said, what, Eric? He said, 2nd year in a row that we haven't had to chaptalize a single cuvee. So they picked relatively early, not sort of fanatically early, but they are one of the early people out there. Yeah. There's been a little bit of a fashion in some sort of chat groups of saying that Costurie and Rousseau and various domains like that have sort of lost their magic. I can't see it with Rousseau. I was slightly disappointed in 2009, which was sort of the first of recent hot years, but only slightly when tasting in barrel. Since then, I've not been disappointed. Of course, it's a risk, given that I don't think they've changed a lot in the way that they do things, and as circumstances, climate changes, it could have an effect. I wondered if they were going to start using more whole bunches, but seemingly not really. They used 1 or 2 in 09, I believe. But they just have their way of doing things, which I imagine started with Armand Rousseau, certainly was the Charles Rousseau style. Eric's continued the same thing. What he's really improved, though, is work in the vineyards. And he's also spread the love a little bit more. So it used to be true, I think, in the classic Charles Rousseau days, that it was really the top three that worked, and the others were nice enough wines, but significantly less further back, if you like. But now I think there is a difference still, but the top three are wonderful. I adore the Ruchotte Chambertin, which is also Clos des Ruchottes, which is also Cyriel's particular favourite. I think the Clos de la Roche is pretty good. And Maisy Chambertin is not bad. Charme Chambertin excites me a little bit less, and so on and so forth. But it's much more consistent, and I like the Village Gevrey Chambertin very much. And they also have the Clos du Château, when a gentleman from Macau bought the Château de Gevrey Chambertin, and everybody threw their hands up in horror. He should not have done, because he's done two things. He is restoring the chateau, the building of the chateau, which the previous owner had never done, and the vineyards are now in much better condition, and the wine is much better because he's given them to Rousseau to look after. So I would much rather that a foreigner of wherever they're from should take over a vineyard than have a local do it badly, is my take on that. Great. Well, keep the chat coming, keep the questions coming, particularly now that we've been through the 5 wines. I hope that lots of you subscribe to get the wines, because it's really, really been worthwhile, and have the 5 wines from the same vineyard in the same year is something that can only be enjoyed rarely. While waiting for additional questions, I'm going to ask you to vote on your 2 favourites out of the 5. You can either be your 2 absolute favourites, or it can be your absolute favourite plus the other one which surprised you and was better than you expected it to be. I'm not allowed to vote. Ronan's not allowed to vote. So it's just you. You should have had plenty of time to think about it. So I'll just count down. Place your 2 votes. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. End of poll, and may we have the results. Okay, well, you're conformists, but why shouldn't you be? Armand Rousseau, it was a magical wine. Fourier narrowly second. Sylvie with her own very particular wine, which incidentally, as time goes by, her idiosyncrasies of winemaking and élevage will drift out, and the vineyard will show more. So she's in 3rd position, Bruno is 4th, and Louis Jadot is 5th, but everybody got some votes, which is encouraging. So thank you for doing that. And my other question is, Gevrey Chambertin Clos St-Jacques, it's currently a Premier Cru. It fought to be a Grand Cru at the start and failed. So what are we going to do? What are we as a panel? Are we going to leave it as a Premier Cru or make it a Grand Cru? Do this on your perception of quality rather than the fact that prices might go up further if it becomes a Grand Cru. So purely on how you rate Clos St-Jacques as a vineyard, do you think it should be a Premier Cru still, i.e. no, or do you think it should be a Grand Cru, i.e. yes? So vote yes for Grand Cru, no for the status quo. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the answer is 3/4, 3-1 in favour of Grand Cru. I mean, most people price it that way. The secondary market prices it that way. Sylvie doesn't. She's very respectable in her pricing. Louis Jadot don't either. Fourier does. Rousseau does. And Bruno Claire, I'm not actually so sure of his prices ex-sellers, but I should think it's up there probably with the Grand Crus. So looking at some of the chat, oh yes, Ian and Emma want to know who won our cricket match. Well, I'm delighted to say, because I mentioned last week that I was going to be back in England and playing cricket, and I did get a game on Saturday. And if you follow my Instagram, you'll see a picture of me pretending to play cricket. And I can say that we got the silver medal, i.e. became 2nd of 2, never mind. But it was so wonderful to be out there and able to do that. I see that we've actually got some new questions have flooded in. And so I will scroll down to find them. Paul wants to know, you always ask the difficult questions, Paul. What about Fourier Centenaire? A good idea, much better than the regular. I don't know what you have to pay in difference if you can get them at first pricing. I didn't taste the 2017 or I think the 18. I don't believe I tasted them side by side. I have a view in various other places about whether there's a difference or not. So I don't think that I have tasted the Fourier Centenaire except once at a dinner in Shanghai when samples came around, but it wasn't alongside the regular. So I'm not going to give you a clear answer on that. But what I would say is that if you can only see it at secondary market prices and there's an enormous difference in price, then it definitely isn't. And Hugo, the Fourier style is absolutely, well, over the last 20 years, so of course Gevrey is coming in around about 94, so that's 25 years ago. So it's evolved and fine-tuned, but the core of the Fourier style was probably in place 20 years ago, but the refinement and the consistency of the success has certainly changed since then. And René, there are no formal applications or thoughts about submitting it for Grand Cru. Nobody needs to. They get the price they want for it. They love the fact that it is just regarded as a wine apart. No one is asking for Chambord-Musigny Les Émeraudes or for Gevrey Clos St-Jacques to be promoted to Grand Cru. They're there in people's minds and in the marketplace, so people are happy with that. It's more the promotions are being asked in villages that don't have any Grand Crus. Hanko wants to know the ageability of the 2017s. Most of them are so delicious already, and aren't they? I mean, a couple of these I felt I really wanted some more time. All of them will go on for a long time. Will they become better with age? Probably will, but it is one of those vintages that you can appreciate young. It's not total infanticide to drink these young. I mean, I could drink the Fourier now. I could drink the I probably only want to keep the Jadot and the Esmona. I'm never quite clear about the pronunciation of the S there, but that's the one which those two I would probably definitely want to keep for them to get clearly better. All the other three will continue to improve, see a little bit more detail, but they're so elegant and so charming now, you probably can. Sid's talking about preferring the complexity of 91 Rousseau over 1990. I think Rousseau absolutely, as some would say, knocked it out of the park in 91. Really, really glorious. I can't remember tasting the Clos St-Jacques very recently. The Chambertin 90 is a stunning, stunning wine, but even then, maybe the 91 over the top of it. Klaus wants to know if I can repeat the hectares cultivated by each of the five. From south to north this time, so you've got 2.20 hectares for Rousseau, 0.89 for Fourier, exactly 1 hectare for Jadot, exactly 1 hectare for Bruno Clair, and 1.60 for Sylvie Emona. In my book, and probably on my website. So the other thing, actually, if you want to have a really in-depth tasting of Clos St-Jacques wines, and again, it's on my Inside Burgundy website. I did a most extraordinary tasting of Clos St-Jacques going way back to the mists of time, and so they were largely Negociant bottlings, but we also had a couple of vintages, the 45 and the 49, from this famous Comte de Moucheron. The 45 bottle wasn't in great condition, but the 49 was pretty good. And the heart stopper for me, for many reasons, emotional as well as for the quality of the wine, was the 1957 Clos St-Jacques from Rousseau. Two reasons. One is because it was Charles Rousseau thought that he preferred 57 to 59. It was the first vintage they would have made of the Clos St-Jacques, having got the vineyard, having bought it in probably late 55. I'm not sure that they made a 56, but the 57 would have been the first proper vintage. It was a great wine. It tasted absolutely wonderful. It also happens to be my year, so yes. So that was total heartthrob standout. What vineyard in Chambertin would you demote Premier Cru to accommodate Clos St-Jacques? Matt, that's cheeky of you. Okay, maybe I could just sort of take little bits out of Charmes, Masouet, Chambertin to make for the 6 hectares, 6.70 hectares in total for Clos St-Jacques. Chapelle Chambertin is one that might suffer a little bit of a fierce inquiry. So between those, I would not demote for sure the 2 big boys. I wouldn't demote La Trussière or Mazy or Ruchot. So it's the ones below the road, the Route des Grands Crus, Chapelle, Griot, Masouet, Charmes, where you would be asking that question. Grand. It's 8:10 in my time. Food is coming. Thank you for your comment, Matt, there. Any last questions? Otherwise, thank you all for being with us tonight. And I should just mention perhaps what we're doing next. Ronan, what have we got next?
I was just going to ask you that.
I think we've got the great white wine vineyards, the Grand Crus. I'm going to look at the 5 Grand Crus based around Montrachet. So, Criot Batin Montrachet, Bienvenue Batin Montrachet, Batin Montrachet, Chevalier Montrachet, Montrachet itself. And to bring us up to our full 6, I've got a mature Coton Charlemagne, 2005 from Bonnet du Martret. If you attended the Bonnet du Martret evening, we didn't do the 05, and it's one of my favorite vintages they've done. So that will be just to see if the Coton Charlemagne can hold itself up alongside those grandest Montrachets. So sign up now and get the samples, because it's not often you can have all of the Montrachets in front of you. And I'm going to be keeping going throughout all of August, once a week, and we're going to do all sorts of different subjects, some grand and some like the aligotés, Puy Fouissé, various things which are more affordable. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for your thank yous. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasper.
At Ronan, etc., etc. And yes, I will see you all next week. Bye.